So today was supposed to be like a cool adventure ride. Instead, it's more like a survival course. We're a Poron Kusama away from home, and you gotta get there. Oh, you don't know what a Poron Kusama is? Let me explain. It's a Finnish word meaning the piss of the reindeer. It's the distance a reindeer can run before it needs to stop to take care of its bathroom business. And the reason why it's a measurement in Finnish is because of the Finnish heritage of reindeer herding. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. No, not reindeers and not bathroom business, the measurements thing. How do you create custom measurements in a fantasy world? And what do they contribute to your cultural world building? And I've got a special treat for you, because I've convinced Dr. Brad Hafford of Artifactually Speaking to allow me to use some of his footage to tell us about ancient Mesopotamia and how they used measurements and what it says about their culture. Check this out.
I'm Dr. Brad Hafford, archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm in the museum's Near East study room to talk about this particular object, which is enigmatic, even though it looks fairly simple. It's a barley party. Barley was probably the most important commodity in all of Mesopotamia. We've probably heard of the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, where people start to farm, to grow their own crops and to raise animals. Well, when they did this, they were able to create surpluses, and those surpluses could feed more and more people. But they needed to know how much they had. So measurement, the control of and understanding of how much of a commodity you have, is vital to be able to survive through winter's lean periods, etc.
So join me on an adventure tour of a Poron Kusama as we figure out how to create custom measurements for fantasy worlds. Oh, come on. You didn't think I'd actually be cycling through a full 20-minute video while I talk to you. Do I look like I'm in that kind of shape? So, first, let's talk about why you might not want to create your own measurements. As fun and immersive as custom measurements can be, they can also create barriers for your readers to enter your world. Imagine trying to remember a whole new set of units just to understand the basic plot of a story. It can be overwhelming. Readers who are unfamiliar with your world might struggle to keep track of these new terms, leading to frustration or even disengagement from your story. Let's unpack some of the major reasons that these barriers to entry come into play. 1. Confusion and lack of clarity. Custom units can easily lead to confusion, especially if they're not clearly explained or if their equivalence to familiar measurements is not made clear within the text. This can be particularly challenging when these measurements are crucial to understanding the plot or the stakes in a scene, especially in battle scenes. Dr. Hafford gives an excellent example of this in his study of ancient Mesopotamian measurements. Let's take a look.
The earliest text we've got, or that we can really understand, we hear that a ration for an adult male was only 60 sela per month. That's 2 sela per day, and approximately. And this has been proposed as a sela bowl, containing 1 sela, 1 unit. The problem is that we don't really know what that unit's equivalent is. We hear about it in the texts a lot, even through this early dynastic, and especially in the Ur III period, we hear about sela bowls.
As you can see, even experts struggle with the details of matching measurements thousands of years later, So, can you imagine how tricky it is for your readers to compare your measurements to what they know from our measurements? And it's not like you can break the fourth wall and go like, this is a kilo, just so that you understand, or whatever the measurement actually is. Because that is non-immersive and breaks the reader out of the story. But somehow you have to communicate to them what your custom measurements mean, and they have to remember that custom measurement for when it becomes important. And if they don't remember it, either they have to just assume a kind of distance, or they have to go back to where you previously defined it. And then reading your book starts to become real work. Closely related to confusion is 2. Overly complex measurement systems is very tempting to world builders, especially in currencies. One of the most common issues readers report with fantasy novels is the complexity of the currency systems with little payoff in the later book. A particularly well-known example is from Patrick Rothfuss's King Killer Chronicle series, where the currency system involves several different types of coins, each with varying values. While this design matches our world, and while it does add depth to the world, it can also confuse readers who have to constantly refer back to the conversion rates to understand the value of the transactions. This complexity can make it difficult for readers to grasp the stakes of a trade, a bribe, or a ransom, distracting from the flow of the story. Now, as I say, this diverse currency is very typical of our world. But in your fantasy world, readers do need to grasp the story while reading it. They're not actually living in your world every day, so those kinds of conversions don't come naturally to them, and they have to remember it. Also, if you don't have a reason to change the measurements from our world, adding the complexity of a fantasy measurement system can lead to fantasy fatigue. This is where the reader becomes exhausted by the sheer volume of unfamiliar concepts they need to remember just to follow the story. There are some elements of your story that absolutely have to have new terms, like your magic system or other sentient races or geographical elements from fantasy and so on. But when your measurement systems are overly complex and they are fantastical and there's no real payoff to it, from the reader's perspective, it can feel like you're just showing off how clever you are rather than actually immersing them in the world. It makes it feel like they're trying to solve a puzzle rather than read a book, and that can detract from the story's emotional and narrative impact. So these are all good reasons not to go with custom measurement. And it might at this point sound like I'm advocating against creating custom measurements. But in fact, I'm a huge fan of custom measurements in fantasy worlds. But you have to be aware of the pitfalls that you need to avoid in order to unlock the benefits of custom measurements. But what are those benefits? If you've enjoyed the video so far, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about why you should implement custom measurements in your fantasy world. Custom measurements can immerse your readers in the culture of your world and show what's truly important to the people who live there. Take Porokusama, for example, the Finnish term which I referred to earlier. This describes the distance a reindeer can travel before needing to urinate, roughly 7.5 kilometers, and reindeers must stop to urinate. A fact which is interesting if you take it into consideration of Santa's sleigh. And that has some implications for that nightly trip. It's also very funny because Tolkien based one of the Elvish languages on Finnish, which means that somewhere in highfalutin Elvish, there's a word that means reindeer piss. It's fantastic. I love it. But this word and this distance measurement isn't just a quirky fact. It is a window into the cultural history of reindeer herding in Finland. Reindeer were integral to the livelihoods of many in the Arctic regions. The habits of these animals, the vast, often harsh landscapes they traverse, and the long distances covered in the wilderness were daily realities that shaped both the language and the culture of the Finnish people. This measurement, therefore, isn't just a practical tool. It carries with it a wealth of cultural significance, reflecting a deep connection to the land and the animals that have supported Finnish communities for millennia. In the same way, ancient Mesopotamians used barley as the foundation for their measurement systems, underscoring how vital this crop was to their survival and their economy. Barley was not just a staple food, it was a cornerstone of the Mesopotamian economy and way of life. It was used to brew beer, to make bread, even to pay workers. This importance is reflected in their measurements, where the smallest units were based on the size and weight of a single barley grain. Dr. Hafford discusses this in detail, illustrating how these measurements were more than just numbers. They were embedded into the fabric of Mesopotamian society. Let's take a look.
Measurement, as standardization becomes more and more important, we don't really understand the earliest measurement because it's before writing, but they are measuring before they start writing. Length and capacity appear to be the first ones, and then weight is the third. And we find that many of the measurements in Mesopotamia have as their basis the barley corn. So the width of a barley corn is the smallest unit measurable in Mesopotamian length, and the barley corn is also the smallest unit of weight. So they use these terms, but the terms get redefined through time, and so they do change. We will find heavy variance in the early periods, maybe less variance, but more definitions in the later periods.
So here we can see the cultural significance of barley for the Mesopotamians. And just as the Finnish measurement of distance speaks to the centrality of the reindeer in their culture, the Mesopotamian measurements remind us of barley's critical role in the ancient world. These measurements serve as historical markers, preserving the values and priorities of the societies that used them. In the same way, you can use these unique measurements to show what is important to your culture, what they value, and even the roots of their history. By crafting your world's measurement systems with care, you can allow your readers to see what your fictional society holds dear, whether it's a precious resource, a revered creature, or a vital trade route. For example, in a desert-based fantasy world, measurements might be based on the distance a camel can travel without water, reflecting how important such an animal is to the life of the environment. Or it could be a fantasy creature and how far it could travel over the desert. In an underground civilization, you might have giant moles that has been domesticated, and distance might be measured in mole burrows, the natural distance a mole digs before resting. These measurements can also inspire new idioms and expressions unique to your world. Imagine your characters using phrases like "as far as a wyvern's flight" or "within a dragon's breath" to describe distances. These expressions wouldn't just add flavor to the dialogue, they would reinforce the cultural context of your world. A wyvern's flight might be a common measure of distance in a land where these creatures are prevalent and feared, giving readers insight into the daily lives and concerns of the inhabitants of this world. And of course, integrating these sayings with our idioms from our world can help the reader understand what distances represent, ameliorating that confusion. So, for example, don't judge until you've walked a mole burrow in her shoes subtly tells the reader that a mole burrow is a unit of distance roughly equal to a mile. Or consider a culture where the most valuable currency is time. Perhaps this society measures distance in sunsets, indicating how long it takes for the sun to set while traveling from one place to another. Expressions like a sunset away would then become part of the vernacular, subtly reminding the reader of this culture's unique relationship with time and distance. By integrating these culturally specific measurements and idioms, you create a richer, more immersive world where every detail from the language to the landscape is interwoven with meaning. These elements don't just add depth, they make your world feel lived in and real, drawing readers deeper into the story with every page. It helps show your world to the reader instead of just saying, "This culture values reindeers, bub. Reindeers are their best animal." Show it through their measurements. And if you think these sound like good reasons to create a custom measurement system, hit that thumbs up button. And let's talk about how to actually create these kinds of systems. The first step in creating custom measurements is to think about how people would start creating measurements and why. Let's take a look at how ancient societies created and standardized their measurements from Dr. Hafford.
The basic unit of length that we might all have heard of in the ancient world is the cubit, or we call it a cubit, from the elbow to the fingertips. And this is about half a meter. On mine, I think it measures about 46 centimeters. But that's the thing. You could tolerate a certain amount of variance. But I could tell you, go measure your arm, and that's about what I want in the size of a reed or something like that. Get a bundle of reeds all about one. It was cush in the Mesopotamian terminology. That is the arm length, or the arm length here. Well, these terms that they come up with get redefined through time to try to make them more standard. If I'm building something that is really important to be precise, then I need a very good standard. But when I'm just doing daily activities, an approximate is perfectly fine.
In the same way as Dr. Hafford just discussed, consider what your people would use as a starting measure on their bodies. This is even more interesting if you don't have humans as your sentient race. Would dwarves measure in beard lengths to start with? Maybe elves would have ear tips as a measurement rather than inches. So start with something the character would have on them, something familiar to the character, and build out from there the basic measurements of the culture. Consistency is important here, but don't be afraid to allow for some variance. Just like in our world, not every foot or cubit has to be exactly the same. These measurements can evolve over time and be subject to different interpretation. You can, of course, here use just your standard measurements from our world for these derived from the human body measurements. After all, if you're just going to use a yard as a measurement, you might as well call it a yard. It's basically a step. I mean, why rename it? But if your people have a strange body part, well then, it's a whole new and fun ballgame. Or even a strange gait. What if they skip? If they skip, they might call the basic step a hop, which, would also be fun. But then we come to the part that applies to all cultures, whether they're human or non-human. The part that's really interesting. Making up measurements related to the culture. Think about what is important to your culture or environment. Just like the Mesopotamians used barley and the Finns used the reindeer, your world's measurements should reflect what matters most to your characters. There are 4 techniques you can apply here to create your measurements. 1. Resource-based measurements. Base your measurement system on a critical resource that is central to the survival or economy of your society. For example, the Mesopotamian barley measurement systems. In ancient Mesopotamia, barley was a fundamental resource used not only as food, but also as a form of currency and a basis for measurements. By using barley grains to define units of length and weight and volume, the Mesopotamians ensured that their measurement system was directly tied to what sustained their society. This naturally occurs in your world. You take the resource that is tied to your economy and you build it in. Then you have these bowls that hold the barley, and that forms the basis for the volume measuring system. So this method makes the measuring system intuitive and reflective of what the culture values most. Eventually, it might even give rise to a currency, perhaps one measured in grain bowls or something similar. The second way to create customized measurements is through distance related to natural phenomena, or the Finnish tradition with reindeer. So here you develop a measurement that relates to natural phenomena or behavior of local wildlife, which are critical to your society. This method of measurement not only ties the unit to the physical world that is around the characters, but also to the cultural practices and necessities of the people of the culture. This can become a base measurement that can eventually feed into a timekeeping system as well as a distance system, and you can tie it back to fantasy animals as well as real animals. Your third way to create a measurement system is with task-based measurement, where you create a measurement based on the time it takes to complete a vital task or the amount of work that can be done in a certain period. For example, the dunam from the Ottoman Empire. The dunam is the distance that can be plowed in a day by a man with 2 yoked oxes. And the size of a dunam varied by region, but it was generally accepted to be 1,000 square meters in modern terms. It was a very practical measurement for tax purposes and for agricultural planning. That kind of measurement is also where we get the term of an acre from, the surface area that can be measured by a man plowing a single field. Task-based measurements give you the opportunity to further expand your fantasy elements as well. Instead of a field the size that a man can plow with 2 yoked oxen, how about the size of a field a team of meerkats can furrow? That way, not only do you have a fun new measurement, but it's tying back to the fantasy aspect of your world, thus immersing the reader even more in your world, until maybe they do feel that they actually live there. And it's our prosaic world with meters and kilograms that is the dream realm. And the last technique you can use to create measurements is cultural symbol-based measurements, where you take an item or symbol or element of cultural importance and use it as a measurement. For example, the perch, or otherwise called the rod or rood from medieval Europe. This distance measured around 16.5 feet and was commonly used in land measurement, particularly in defining the dimensions of fields, roads, and buildings. It was often tied to cultural symbols such as the standard length of rods used by knights and soldiers, which reflected military and social hierarchies. The perch thus served as both a practical measurement and a symbol of the feudal system where land ownership and military service were closely linked. In Sangwheel Chronicles, my epic fantasy world, with its heavy link to sashes as signs of rank, I might define field lengths by sash lengths, if that ever came up, which, to be fair, it hasn't. What cultural symbol would you use in your world for such a measurement? Let me know in the comments below. By using these techniques, you can create measurement systems in your world that not only feel authentic, but also deeply resonate with the culture and values of your fictional society. So, that I am plagued by planes today. Your measurement could be how far a plane flies before it finds somebody's video and ruins it. So that was quite an adventure in custom measurements. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll join me again for another piece of world building. If you would like to support what I do here at the channel and help keep a roof over my head as opposed to running wild in the Finnish wilderness when the rain is pouring, you can join my channel membership for as little as a cup of coffee a month, and you can get all of these cool perks, including early access to my videos. But please don't feel obligated to join the channel or support me financially. You can also support what I do here just by watching another video. Since you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy my video about spinning and why it's important in world building. So check that out. Or you could trust the algorithm's recommendation. And I will see you soon for another episode from Just in Time Worlds, where we build what we need when we need it. Me actually arriving home after that ride. And yes, it was about 7.5 kilometers from my house. And yes, I am soaked like Rishi Sunak calling the British election. Cheers.